All right, so now we are going to do chapter 12, which is yield percent and when to ignore it. So we talked about yield percent a little bit, in chapter 7 and 8, and we talked about it with edible portion cost. But there are times that yield percent will actually mislead you, so you need to know when to avoid it. So in these slides, we're going to talk about when yield percent is not used to calculate the as purchased quantity, and then you'll also learn how to explain when yield percent is not used to calculate the edible portion cost. And we'll talk some scenarios. So to determine whether or not to use yield percent, you need to determine if the food being purchased is being used as is or does it need to be trimmed down and cleaned. So on the left side, if your answer is yes, food is being trimmed down, then you most likely need to account for the trim loss, depending on how the recipe is written. So for example, if a recipe is written that, you need 15 oranges, okay, and you just need to peel them, but each individual person at an event is going to get one whole orange, then you don't need to account for that. But if you were going to say, if the recipe called for 15 cups of oranges, then you would have to account for the trim loss. So it's different in each scenario. That's why there's not one size fits all. You just need to kind of be able to read the scenario and determine if you need to use it. Another example is pear sorbet requires just the pear flesh. The waste must be accounted for by dividing the edible portion quantity by the yield percent, because you're not going to use the peel or the core of that pear. You're just using the flesh. All right, so it's again, there's no one size fits all. So on the right side, if your answer is no, the food is being used as is. So if the recipe calls for 3 cloves of garlic, there's not a lot of trim on garlic, so you don't need to account for the yield percent. So if a recipe lists ingredients in count that has less than 100% yield, it's most likely you're not using the yield percent. So for example, a recipe calls for 1 pear per person. Even though you may trim the pear, it is not necessary to buy extra pears because you're just going to give 1 pear per person. So you don't need to account for the trim loss. All right, let's give some more examples. So there are the 2 exceptions to the exception. Okay. Ingredients, exception number 1. Ingredients are listed by count, but requires a specific cut, like a melon ball or a tournée carrot. Often when you see those 2 different scenarios where there's a specific, cut, there's going to be a lot more trim. So you will probably, in most cases, you need to account for the yield percent because they don't sell those things prefabricated or pre-cut. On the right, the exception number 2, when ingredient is listed by weight or volume, you usually need to use the yield percent. Again, when you have different scenarios, your teacher will help you. However, if you have to convert it, it might not be needed. So I know it gets kind of confusing, but we'll show some more examples. So here's the example here. Recipe calls for 12 fluid ounces of fresh lemon juice. You have the conversion that 1 pound of lemons is 6.5 fluid ounces. So in that case, because you have the conversion, you don't need to buy more because you know exactly how much it's going to yield from that pound of lemons. But in not every situation do you have the conversion information. So, all right, let's do some more practice. All right, so scenario 1, determine if the situation requires you to use the yield percent to calculate quantity or cost. So a recipe calls for 6 cups of diced pears. You are calculating the cost of the pears and buy them by the pound, okay? So yes, in this scenario, you need to use yield percent, okay? Why? When a recipe specifies the volume measurement, which is the 6 cups of pears, and you're buying the pears by weight, it's always a really good idea to consider the yield percent because you don't want to run out. There's going to be waste in those pears of the peel, the stem, the core, etc. This will ensure that you're going to have enough pears to match the recipe's needs. Okay, so you'll calculate the yield percent, the usable weight of the pears, after you divide the total weight of the pears and then adjust with the trim. All right, and then you purchase accordingly following those formulas. So scenario number 2, again, you're going to determine if the situation requires you to use yield percent or calculate the quantity or cost. So a recipe calls for 3 grapefruits juiced. You're determining how many grapefruits to buy. So in this case, no, you do not need to use yield percent. Since the recipe asks for 3 whole grapefruits to be juiced, you're just going to buy 3 grapefruits and you're going to juice them, and the trim does not matter because it's calling for specific amount, 3 juiced grapefruits. All right, in the last situation, the recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of chopped garlic. You buy garlic by the bulb. You're determining how many bulbs to purchase. No, you do not need, and this is where it can be a little bit confusing. You do not need to use yield percent in this scenario. And the reason why is that the recipe asks for the 2 tablespoons of chopped garlic, but you're buying them by the bulb. You just need to estimate the number of bulbs. There's minimum waste, so you don't really need to account for the yield percent because you're not really wasting anything. You just need to kind of think through the conversion of how many individual cloves are in a bulb and determine it that way, but you don't need to account for yield percent. All right, so now here is the Chapter 12 written practice problems. Again, go through each one, and then if you write them out, if you need any help, please reference the Chapter 12 written practice problem screencast. Thank you.